Today's event with 2 invited talks on supporting open science, followed by 4 lightning talks on a variety of science librarianship topics. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First, please remain muted throughout the event unless you're asking a question. Second, there will be time for Q&A after both the invited talks are concluded, and then again after all 4 lightning talks. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat that is being monitored today by one of my committee members. You are also welcome to raise your hand and then unmute to ask questions. And then third, this forum is being recorded today and will be shared later. So today for our first talk, we have Sanja Gidakovic presenting librarian support for teaching open science research practices in higher education. Sanja is a STEM librarian at the University of Central Missouri and a doctoral student in the School of Information and Learning Technologies at the University of Missouri. Her research focuses on open science practices, particularly the intersection of open access to scholarly literature and evolving AI technologies. You're welcome to share your screen and start, Sanja. Thank you.
Okay, I'll get started, and I'm assuming you can all hear me well. Okay. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me for this talk. So I will talk about a research study that I published on librarian support in teaching open science research practices in higher education. I've included the link to the study, and I will share these slides at the end of the presentation. I've already been introduced again. I'm a science librarian at the University of Central Missouri. I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Missouri-Columbia in the Information Science and Learning Technologies department. And then some of my research interests are around scholarly communications, open science practices, and more recently, I've had a focus on open access and how that drives the evolving AI research assistance. So I'll just talk about my study, the research question findings, a little bit of discussion, and then once my talk is finished and the other individuals, there will be room for questions. So this was my research question. This study was conducted throughout 2022, 2023, and published in 2024. And it was exploratory at the time because it was designed to investigate the trends of librarian teaching support for open science research practices in higher education. So it was happening around the same time around that Nelson memo was happening, and now it's in effect. I'm assuming if I were to collect new data on this, that I would find different findings, but maybe not so much, because this study was primarily focused on teaching support, not so much the service of it. Like I said, I primarily focus on teaching open science practices for undergrad and grad education, and some of those practices that I focused on included on how is open access, open methodology, open data, reproducible analysis, replicable research, and questionable research practices translated into kind of education and teaching that in the classroom. In terms of the why, this study was done at the beginning of my doctoral program. So it was kind of like an ongoing interest driven by my practice as a librarian. And I just wanted to mention that where I work right now, my university is primarily teaching focused, so like bachelor's and master's granting. So it's not as high research activity as Research One universities. So I was thinking about how can I teach students to the lectures that I've been invited beyond just finding scholarly articles. And then as I was conducting research on open science research practices, I thought that that would be kind of like a low-cost barrier entry to show what happens behind the scenes of research. So beyond finding just a scholarly article, so like finding maybe data collection that was shared with an article that students could kind of like see what happens behind the scenes if there's like limited time in classroom, or if, you know, like I said, I work at more like teaching focused universities where maybe the opportunities to teach that aren't as high. So basically that's what drove this study. In terms of methodology, so I utilized a mixed method sequential exploratory design. In phase 1, I conducted qualitative interviews that were semi-structured, and I've had 5 participants where I interviewed for this phase. And then this phase informed the quantitative survey, which I analyzed where 26 academic librarians completed the survey. And again, that was collected from 2022 to early 2023. So I'll talk about each phase. Interview findings kind of informed the survey, and they kind of corroborated each other. So I've interviewed 5 participants, and most of the participants worked at high research activity universities. And all the roles kind of involved liaison activities between disciplines of sciences and social sciences, but more more science-centric roles. So I found 3 major themes. Theme 1 was, at the time, like the pedagogy, so the teaching practice of open science wasn't really mandated across institution. And just like any kind of liaison role, adoption depended largely on faculty interest and librarian interest. And then I had only 1 participant that actually specifically had open science reproducibility in their job description. In terms of theme 2, open science initiatives vary in librarian roles. Again, most librarians incorporated through their liaison work or personal initiatives, which is kind of similar to my experience. Again, some participants supported OS through institutional opportunities like scholarship offices, scholarly communication departments, so departments within the library and then outside of the library. And then some programs or some universities had programs that created, I think, more of embedded opportunities to integrate teaching of open science practices, like undergraduate research opportunities or first-year research experience opportunities. In terms of theme 3, open science teaching and collaboration again varies. Teaching modalities span between workshops, one-shots, embedded instruction, being embedded within credit-bearing courses, and so forth. There was only 1 librarian that was consistently embedded within an undergraduate curricula, which was that first-year research opportunity experience program, while others in this group of 5 participants provided mostly one-shot sessions and consultations, often just working with graduate students, faculty, and researchers, with some undergrad students as well. So the big reveal for interview findings, I think this is kind of like the meat of it, what I wanted to find out. So common teaching activities included teaching students how to write data management plans like data dictionaries as well, what open access publishing entails, what the research workflow looks like in documentation if you want to be more open in your transparent in your research. They also taught scientific misconduct and research ethics, like questionable research practices, and then also use of tools and platforms that support open science practices, like using R or OSF, and then again, research transparency and reproducibility. I wanted to include this slide because this is the example of that 1 participant that was consistently embedded in that first-year undergraduate research experience course. It's kind of like a practical example, and within my study, you'll find that there's a bigger description of this if you're just interested in, like, from practical perspective, how is this done? And so they were embedded within this program where students in the program conducted research. They collected data from a university-wide survey. And so what they did was require for all pieces of information to be shared in public and with their peers. For instance, when they do the method section, it's to their classmates. They were required to create a data dictionary and a data management plan that was all included in the OSF platform. And so what they would do at each checkpoint of the research lifecycle or the process of research was provide an introduction, overall requirements for open scholarship components, and after each checkpoint, I would come back and debrief and provide feedback. So that's kind of like that thick example from this study of an opportunity where they were kind of collaborating with broader campus and kind of embedded within the program that was ongoing for them. And then finally, in theme 3, there were also different views of teaching OS at undergrad and grad level. Some believe that comprehensive training is suitable for grad students.
Perfect, thank you.
And others believe that undergraduates benefit from early exposure to OS practices as well. Participants also emphasize that librarians don't necessarily need to have expert level knowledge of tools, because I think that's like a fear for most, like using R, Python, OSF. They need to know, just kind of like anything in librarianship, like why something is used, the roles for it in the research, and how to guide researchers toward appropriate resources. Okay, so moving on to my survey results, it included 26 responses, and most of the participants, again, work mostly at very high research activity institutions. Similarly, they fill liaison librarian roles or teaching and research roles. And most of the programs that they support are also mostly science with some social science programs. And so the survey results really reinforced my interview results. Open science instruction in academic libraries really is largely driven by individual librarians rather than institutional mandates, at the time at least. So 77% reported that OS instruction is not mandated. One respondent actually said that OS teaching was formally mandated at their university. And 69% said that teaching open science practices are primarily their own initiative. And some said that their library has a mission statement supporting open practices, which I'm assuming is related to the service of scholarly communications. Libraries support open science through multiple services. So most respondents, like 90% of them, actively provide this instruction, and 65 of them collaborate within their own libraries units to promote and deliver instruction, which is within the scholarly communications departments. And then collaboration, similar to what I mentioned in my interview findings, collaboration also extends beyond the library, which is kind of similar to what liaison roles really are like. So they frequently collaborate with campus partners to support OS instruction. So offices of research, graduate studies, that's similar to my experience, data science and computing units, and whatever kind of research initiatives are available on campus that can be integrated with this kind of practice. So undergrad research initiatives is one example as well. Similar to my interview findings, participants deliver OS instruction through a range of teaching methods, so one-shots, embedded, and so forth. And audiences taught vary between grad and undergrad students. And again, common OS lesson plans, similar to what I discussed about the interview findings. Again, most of them teach how to publish in open access, what the difference or what reproducibility, replicability means, writing data management plans, publishing research data, how to be more transparent and organized in research, and how to use open science tools and platforms. What I gathered from both was that OS concepts are often integrated into broader workshops and research instruction rather than taught as standalone sessions. I'd be curious to know about everybody else's experience in this, but I can connect to this as well. In terms of professional development needs, many librarians seek independent professional development when asked about this. So some mentioned that they attend carpentries or join communities like reproducibility. And then nearly all respondents mentioned that they indicated a need for additional training, particularly in understanding disciplinary research tools and technologies that support open science practices. So just a little bit of a conclusion discussion. Basically, the main thing is librarians play a key role in teaching and promoting OS practices within the classroom, despite maybe limited institutional mandates. Most OS initiatives are driven by librarians' own interests and are integrated into existing work responsibilities. This makes sense. I'm not sure how much of that would change right now. And then again, collaboration with faculty and campus partners is essential for OS instruction. But again, we have key challenges like limited time that were expressed in the interviews, competing responsibility, and then a need for additional training. So, but we do have an important place in open science education, particularly again in light of new federal policies requiring immediate public access to research. And then lastly, because it's been a minute since I published this, and for my studies, I'm kind of just constantly evolving and learning about just open science, open access. And what you've kind of gleaned from my study is that instruction really varies by institution type and what opportunities there are, what kind of research initiatives they have. As most of the respondents worked at very high research activity universities, but I'm still curious what that looks like at universities like mine, teaching focused, where OS is also an opportunity, again, in limited funding structures to teach about the behind the scenes of research. Something else I wanted to say, despite mandates or initiatives that are instituted, there are variations in disciplinary norms, funding structures, policy mandates that influence OS adoption. Disciplinary norms, the more you learn about science of science, the more you think there are some disciplines that, even if they're not kind of mandate to practice open science practices, maybe they don't want to because maybe the discipline is competitive, or some researchers from my previous research expressed that they don't necessarily want to share their data because they'd like to continue to work on that particular project and publish more. So there are variations in how this is kind of instituted. I still think open science practices improve accessibility, benefit the scholarly community, especially end users, but it should be noted that they require significant, again, financial investment in publishing fees, infrastructure, and long-term support systems. Again, they're great for the community, but there's also kind of difference in who can participate in these practices. So I'll leave it at that. That was kind of my interpretation. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So I will say thank you, and then I'm reserving questions for afterwards.
Sanja, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation.
Thank
We
you.
will be transitioning now to our second talk before we take questions for all of our presenters. So our next presentation is Strengthening Research Support, Scholarly Communication Training for Liaison Librarians, presented by Elaine Walker and Karleigh Riesen. Elaine is the Scholarly Communications Librarian at the University of Alabama, specializing in open access publishing, copyright, author rights, and research impact metrics. With a strong background in academic librarianship, she supports faculty and students throughout the research lifecycle, offering guidance on publishing strategies, the institutional repository, and compliance with further mandates. Karleigh is the Associate Dean for Research and User Services at the University of Alabama. Her research interests include expanding campus partnerships, student learning outcomes assessment, library instruction pedagogy, resource sharing, and liaison librarian practices. So you've already shared your screen, and you are welcome to begin. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Elaine Walker, and today our presentation matches the name of a paper that we had published back in November. So Strengthening Research Support, Scholarly Communication Training for Liaison Librarians. So basically, we're very briefly going to share how we developed this resource called Open Access Reports, used to support our liaison librarians' scholarly communication knowledge, how those reports were created, and what we learned in assessing their effectiveness. So I will let Karleigh talk a little bit more about the background. Let's see.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Hi, everyone. So just a little bit of context of how this project and the open access reports came about. Elaine and I had been having a lot of conversations about scholarly communication questions and conversations with liaisons, and we were noticing that a lot of liaisons were receiving more and more scholarly communication questions. And so kind of the practice was when a liaison would get an in-depth or a more in-depth scholarly communication question, or if it was kind of at a more basic level, but they just weren't sure how to answer it, that they would reach out to Elaine, and either Elaine would be able to answer that question, or they would collaborate and come up with a response to the faculty member, student, program, or course together. But what I was noticing was that liaisons were also starting to get not just more questions via email, but a lot more questions on the spot. So, for example, at graduate student orientations, we were getting a lot of questions about open access publishing, a lot of questions about predatory publishing, especially as a lot of grad students are leaning more towards a dissertation model of publishing 3 articles as opposed to one large dissertation. And so liaisons were in those moments wanting more, wanting to develop more of an understanding of these various kind of scholarly communication practices and topics. And so in those moments where it's an on-the-spot question, Elaine and I were talking and thinking about, well, what are some ways that we can help liaisons strengthen their knowledge in this particular area? And so we first started off by having Elaine come to some liaison meetings and share answers to some of these questions and be available to answer questions from liaisons. And we also had Elaine present and she led a workshop about these topics for liaisons as well. And as that was developing, we also realized, we still wanted to develop some other method of support for our liaisons who were continuing to receive more and more questions about scholarly communication topics and thinking about ways that we could assist them as they were kind of developing this skill set and this new knowledge. Which led to the creation of the open access reports, which Elaine is going to talk about in more detail.
Thank you, Karleigh. Yeah, so to get started, the open access reports were really just designed to be very concise, tailored reports for each individual liaison. And as a lot of you guys know, liaison librarians cover more than one area. So in order to get us started and to keep me from being overwhelmed with creating these reports, I asked, probably at one of the meetings, I asked the liaisons to give me one discipline area that was either like their largest area that they worked with, or maybe a department that they were receiving the most scholarly communications related questions from. And so I used that as my starting point. And before I go any further, I have to give credit to the original idea of this resource. Let's see, I think their names were Jessica Lang and Carrie Hansen from McGill University. They posted or published an article in 2020 about a similar resource that they called a scholarly communication reports. And so I came across this article when I was doing a literature review for another paper, and I just got inspired by it. And I was like, this is a really great idea. So I took that idea and kind of reshaped it in a way that would better fit the needs of our library here. And so it was just a really great starting point for us to get this going and match the needs that we were addressing here in our libraries. So I've also linked that article in our bibliography slide on the last page. So if you kind of want to see the progression of our idea from the original, so their article is here, and then our article is linked here as well. And so these reports are just a couple of pages long. They're very high level as far as detail goes. So it's really just giving the liaisons a starting point and helping them have a stronger knowledge base for answering those questions that they were receiving at instruction sessions or departmental meetings that they get invited to. So it's really just designed to be a reusable resource and an updatable resource as well. So I try to keep in mind, how can I, make the layout in a way that it can be updated regularly. So since this is kind of a newer initiative for us, we're about 2 years in now. And so I think about every 2 years, I'll update the information that is in the reports. So that's what I'm going to talk about next, is how the reports are laid out. So starting off, we have about 16 of them, probably more now, because as time goes on, the liaisons might request another report for another area. So basically what they are made up of is just general open access definitions and terminology. There's citation insights. There's a publication table with kind of like the top 10 journals that that department or that discipline area. Sometimes it includes more than one department. Kind of just gives some insights on where they're publishing. And then the last page is just professional development resources for the liaison librarians. So, for example, Karleigh, if this was your area, the social work department has a lot of questions about copyright. And so on the professional development resources page, I just had a couple of like links out to copyright basics and things like that for more for like professional development internally. The publication table on the second page, I'll just go ahead and go to the example here. So this is what it looks like. I just took a screenshot of this is like the first 2 pages. This is typically what all of the reports look like across the board. The only thing that changes is like the names of the journals and the information within it. But this is essentially the template. It's not the prettiest, but is rather functional for our purposes here. And this will evolve and change and update over time. So I wanted to start with just the basics of what open access is and the 2 main models that we get the most questions about. On our campus, our faculty and a lot of our students don't quite understand the difference between gold open access and green open access and how that can be applied to sharing their work in the institutional repository and beyond. So I wanted to just start with the basic definitions and also emphasize the importance of the versions of manuscripts that can be shared, because that also creates a lot of confusion, not just internally, but for our faculty and the newer faculty as well. The second section are the citation insights. This is just some very high level information like total amount of publications, how many times they were cited, average number of citations per item. I have just the general breakdown of open access versus subscription publications. So my example here is the chemistry department. They are pretty active in publishing. So these were some good, fun numbers to work with. So here, I did update this a little bit more recently. We started this in 2024, but I updated this last year, around this time last year, because I was invited to a departmental chemistry department meeting, and they actually wanted a copy of this. So I had showed, I think, just the publication table to the faculty, and they asked to have a copy of the report. And so that was a nice, pleasant surprise. So I was happy to share this with them. So sometimes even, I think the nursing department too also requested a copy of this. So it's interesting to see the faculty interested in seeing these numbers. So there's this information came from several different places, like the citation insights came from journal citation reports, the information about each journal, their publishing model, article processing charges, the embargo period. Those all came from journal citation reports, looking at the journal website itself, because usually that was the only place to find the most up-to-date article processing charge price. And then sometimes even using Open Policy Finder was helpful too, especially with getting links to the right pages. So it saved me a little bit of time there. And then I also included just some basic information about our institutional repository under the journal table. And this was originally designed to be an internal resource. So this was just a way to kind of remind the liaisons that, hey, we have an institutional repository. These are some of the benefits or talking points that you can use to help promote it. And if you guys have any further questions, you can reach out to me or have the faculty, reach out to me with any additional questions here. And so the last page of it, this is just the resources page. So pretty simple and boring here, but this is just a list of resources that I thought would be most helpful for the liaison librarians if they wanted to do a little bit more digging, just to get more familiar with things like Creative Commons licenses, maybe some copyright basics, and predatory publishing. And we definitely get a lot of questions about predatory publishing. We have faculty members reaching out to us all the time, saying, hey, I'd like to publish in this journal. Can you confirm that it's a legit publication. And so I wanted to help make sure to include this here so that the liaisons can share these resources and get some practice with using it themselves in case they are also presented with those questions. So the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the intended uses were, and Karleigh touched on this a little bit with the background information. So we really just wanted this to be like kind of a quick reference that can be pulled up pretty conveniently just to support the liaisons while they're doing instruction or preparing for an instruction session. If they're attending events around campus, like maybe new faculty orientation or things like that, other events where faculty and students are going to be gathering, it can really be helpful to be able to reference this. And I also encourage it to share the reports out. If people ask for them, there's no reason to keep it a secret. They can have access to it, if they want to see it. So we just want to empower not just our own librarians, but our campus members as well to learn more about scholarly communication. So it's really established a great foundation for continued professional development because a lot of us know that these things are changing all the time. Sanja was also talking about the federal open access research policies with those things constantly changing. So it's a lot to stay on top of. And so I might end up having to update these a little bit more frequently than 2 years and maybe adding more information about open access policies at the federal level because I am getting more questions about that. So there's always going to be room for improvement here, depending on how the nature of the field is changing over time and also based on the questions that are coming from it. It's also been a great way to collaborate with our liaisons. Sometimes we will, both of us, the liaison librarian and myself, will be invited to an instruction session. So that's always fun. It gives a lot of opportunities to get to know my colleagues a little bit better and just kind of establish a more sound relationship with my colleagues. So there's been lots of benefits that came from this, both internally and helping to teach our faculty and students more about scholarly communications. And Karleigh's going to talk a little bit more about how we assessed the effectiveness of the reports.
Yeah, so Elaine and I, we wanted to have the report available and to offer this training to our liaisons, but we also wanted to see, as the title of this slide suggests, how effective was it? So we didn't want to get into too much detail with the article that we wrote. Elaine mentioned we do have it linked in our bibliography at the end of the PowerPoint, but we did an IRB study assess the effectiveness. So we asked the liaisons to fill out a pre and post survey. So they filled out a survey prior to receiving their open access reports. They received the reports. They had opportunities to talk with Elaine, and Elaine came to some of our liaison meetings. So they had about a semester or two to use the open access report. And then we sent them a follow-up survey after that year to see were these useful? Did their confidence levels grow? So that was one thing. At the pre-survey, we assessed some of their confidence levels and answering some of these questions. We asked and assessed how often they were receiving these types of questions, what questions they had. And then the follow-up survey was, again, assessing, well, now that you have these reports, you've had this year of experience kind of using these, where is your confidence level now? What questions do you still have? And we also asked what pieces of the report were most helpful, which were the least helpful, and what areas could this report grow and change to continue to meet your needs as you're continuing to learn more about scholarly communication topics. So what we noticed in our survey results, our sample is really small. We had 11 participants respond, but across the board, we saw confidence levels increase in terms of answering scholarly communication questions. And we saw the largest jumps in confidence, specifically in talking about predatory publishing, scholarly publishing, and open educational resources. And we also were able to see that, yes, these reports were meeting their needs and expectations. And then the definitions that Elaine had described, we found were the most valuable components. So, that component of which piece of the open access report really might grow and evolve. I anticipate that would grow and evolve as liaisons become more confident and answer more and more questions. So I think right now it was about kind of building that baseline knowledge. And now with the confidence, greater confidence levels, they might find different pieces of the report helpful as they continue to use it. And so we've been really pleased with these results, and it was really great to see that this has been not just hearing from our liaisons in conversations, but from the survey results that we got back, kind of seeing, yes, this is helpful. This is how it's been helpful. These are the pieces that are helpful. And it's been wonderful to see confidence levels increase as well. And so we hope to be able to continue to provide this resource for our liaisons and continue to help them gain more confidence in other aspects of scholarly communication topics.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karleigh. And I think now we can take questions. Yeah, and here's our bibliography with the inspiration for our idea and then our article on our version of the scholarly communication reports. And I will stop sharing.
All right, thank you so much, Elaine and Karleigh. So we do have about 15 minutes or so now for questions for both sets of the presenters. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And like I said, one of my colleagues on the committee will be moderating that. You're also welcome to go ahead and raise your hand and then unmute to ask your questions.
Well, I can go ahead and get us started. We had a few questions in the chat already. The first one is for Sanja. How has AI changed the nature and instructional means for open science? And I see that you did start to address this in the chat, but if you want to talk about it more broadly. And there was a follow-up question as well about how faculty might be hesitant to make their work open because they're concerned about their work being scraped. So.
Right, I think I'll start. So I can't really speak to how it impacts open science practices because it's kind of evolving still. But I did share just a recent study that we were working on, primarily focusing on open access journals, because a lot of these emerging AI research tools are basically using open indexes like Semantic Scholar, OpenAlex, Google Scholar, PubMed, to kind of make their database work, right? So we were kind of curious how open access journals are represented within those specific tools, like I think it was Elicit, SciSpace, Consensus. And then what we found was that based on the sample from DOAJ's open access journals, that it missed a lot of quality journals when certain rankings or filters were used within those AI research assistant tools. So effectively, like the user would miss potentially really useful resources that way because they were trying to, I guess, instill trust with the user by saying we're using quartile ranking systems to get you the best literature out there. So I can speak to that, but in terms of, I said this in the chat, I'm not completely sure how these systems will so I think it will be interesting how like this will evolve basically, and what that means for open science practices. If some maybe researchers might not be open to AI developers and tools using their research for their own kind of profits is kind of like my take on it. But yeah, does that make sense? Yeah.
Did anyone have a follow-up question to that? Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Someone was asking Elaine about how long it takes to complete a report, like the report creation, and how often you update those reports.
Yeah, that's a great question. Starting from scratch, if I'm making a brand new one, I would say about an hour and a half to 2 hours, maybe tops. I want to say that getting that publication table together with the top 10 journals, that is the most time consuming part. There's a lot of back and forth. There's no one website with all of that information on it. And if there is, and I don't know about it, I would be more than happy if you share that with me. So right now it's kind of a little bit of bouncing back and forth between journal citation reports, Open Policy Finder, and the journal's website itself. I did find that some of the publishers like Sage and Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, they have APC tables that you can download for all of their, thousands of journals that they might have under their, publication umbrella. But sometimes I've noticed that over time, if I'm going back, that spreadsheet that I download might be outdated. And so sometimes I really just prefer to go to the journal's website and look at that page, the scope and the about page, and that will usually have the most updated APC information, because I've noticed that when I go to update them, about every 2 years, I think is going to be my cycle right now, because this is still pretty new. So I'm just in my first iteration of like going across the board and updating the top publications. But sometimes I'll do one, if I get invited to a department meeting to speak to their faculty about APCs and open access, I might, do a quick update for that one department just to, have the most up-to-date information for them. But if one if it's already been created and I'm just going back and updating it, I'd say about 30 minutes.
Thank you. And I'm just curious, we have another question related to this, but I may have missed, do you include information about any read and publish agreements that you offer through your institution? Is that included on a report?
No, it's not. We personally don't have very many of those, and so we just answer those internally if we have questions. Yeah.
Thank you. So one more question. Apologies for missing this. I think I might have missed this too. Oh boy, so it moved. How do you share this content with your liaison? Is this a PDF or a Google Doc? How are you providing access to these reports?
Yeah, that's another good one. So we use Box on our campus. That's like one of our internal resource sharing mediums here. And so I have a Box folder. They're currently just in Word documents. That's kind of been the easiest way to go in and update them. So if I open the document in Word and I save it, it will also save it back to Box. So it's in this one, big folder that all of the liaisons have access to. And as we hire new liaisons, or sometimes the responsibilities will shift around, so someone might pick up another department, and they'll see that one may already be in there, or it might not. I also wanted to touch a little bit on when someone was asking me how much time it takes. It also just depends on the department. Like the Department of Philosophy, they're not super active publishers like compared to chemistry. So like I think for their table, I didn't even have 10 journals to list. It was just like a top 5. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on that.
I think I'm seeing primarily comments in the chat now. I think that covered all of our questions at this time. Any other questions in the room? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a question about the reports as well. I'm kind of curious, did you consider including information about the companies, sort of their business information, like of the publishers, what percentage of the market do they have of scientific publishing, or how much money did they make last year? I think as liaisons, we're always like surprised that other people don't realize how big of a market or how much money or they're making.
I haven't thought about including that, but that is interesting and also infuriating sometimes to think about. I personally haven't received any questions about that from my liaison colleagues or any faculty members, but I do have a slide in one of my just kind of general open access presentations that talks about like the profit margins and how that ties in with open access. But I have not thought about putting that in the report yet. Thank you. I am trying to keep them like as short and useful as possible, but that might be worth sharing at some point.
have a question for both sets of presenters. So both of your projects in some way touch on like building capacity for open science or open access work, whether that's through these internal training tools like the OARs or those teaching practices. And so personally in your own work, like what approaches have you found most effective in helping librarians move from basic awareness of open science to more proactive engagement?
I can start off first. I think so. Like I said, I work more at a teaching focused university. We don't have a scholarly communications department here. So it kind of happens based on, like I'm a science librarian, so more like from faculty interest and uptake, and then working with different kind of departments. So one example of that, like I don't necessarily train other librarians on open science practices, but I do collaborate and we do teach graduate studies workshops in the library. And so there are components that are weaved into those workshops that touch upon open science practices, like being transparent, talking about questionable research practices and research ethics, and how to kind of document your workflow depending on what you're working on. And then we also collaborate here with an undergraduate research experience opportunity McNair scholarship program. And so basically each librarian is a mentor for that program. And so we're kind of paired up with a student based on what subject they're in or department they're in. So I'm mostly paired up with science disciplines. But we also provide seminars for those students. And then within those seminars, we kind of collaborate on primarily teaching about research documentation and then questionable research practices. But it's just kind of like, not like a service, but more like based on how we collaborate with other departments. So hopefully that answers your question.
I would say for us, thinking specifically through the lens of the liaisons here, having this document has helped them be more proactive in terms of assisting faculty and students with these types of questions, especially kind of in those like live sessions where it's in the classroom and an orientation, but also the reports, and Elaine touched on this a little bit, has been a really good opportunity for collaboration, whether that's between liaisons or liaisons and Elaine, our scholarly communications librarian. And so as we start getting more interest and questions about these types of topics, liaisons now are more I would say they're more proactive about including a slide in an orientation about these topics because there's more confidence and there's more of kind of an ability to speak kind of generally to some of these topics where there might not have been before. And then that has opened the door for more questions and for more conversations between faculty and students. They can bring up these types of topics at faculty meetings and be able to like speak more about these various topics. And then in terms of more collaboration with Elaine, there's been more of an opportunity to have to like co-present and to co-teach sessions for graduate students who might be working on their like three-part dissertation and then their three-article dissertation, and then they're able to the liaison and Elaine are able to co-teach that, but that opportunity then gives the liaison the opportunity to learn more like specialized pieces of the skill set from Elaine. So then further on down the road, there's always the option and the opportunity to collaborate with Elaine, but then there's also the option where, you know, maybe they have developed and feel more confident and they're able to lead that session on their own. And so it's created, like I said, it's created more opportunity for collaboration, but it's allowed them to position themselves to be more proactive to these types of conversations and these types of questions as opposed to reactive. And it's been real positive.
I can also back that up with saying that I am receiving more like self deposits into our institutional repository. Even though we're at a large research university, I am ScholComm party of one, essentially. So for the most part, in order to get like, faculty buy-in to use the IR, I would always say, I'll just deposit it for you. I've got, just send it to me. I got you, I'll do it. But I've noticed, over the last year and a half or so, I'm getting more and more, deposit notifications from our institutional repository. We use DSpace, and I'll say, oh, that's a, professor from the Department of Anthropology that I don't think I've done any outreach with, but they probably through our liaison learned that they could deposit their work in the repository and they're doing it. So that's been a really exciting, kind of evidence that it's working. And also, I'm not getting quite as many emails and questions forwarded to me. So I feel like that also tells me that like, hey, they're able to answer some of these questions, on their own confidently. And a lot of times they might not be directed or referred to me, but they will copy me into the email and I'll just kind of, just look at the conversation, and jump in if I need to. But yeah, I think those are two ways that I think prove as evidence that it's working.
Thank you so much for those answers. It sounds a lot of like building capacity through collaboration. Do we have any more questions? We have a few more minutes for questions. All right. This is a long form today, so we are a little bit of ahead of schedule. So why don't we take about a 3-minute break just so everyone can step away, take a big breath, and then we'll jump back in here at 12:56 for our lightning talks. We'll see you back in just a minute. Thank you. All right, everyone, welcome back. It's been about 3 minutes, so we'll go ahead and get started with our lightning talk portion now. And once again, after all 4 lightning talks, we'll have time for questions for all of the presenters at the end. So first, we have Supporting Ethnobotanical Learning with Library Materials, a Needs and Collection Analysis, presented by Abbey Lewis. Abbey is the STEM Engagement Librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder. She serves as the subject specialist for ecology and evolutionary biology and molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. So Abby, you're welcome to share your screen and go ahead and get started.
Thanks. Hi, I am Abbey Lewis, the STEM Engagement Librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder. Isa is a library student employee who joined me in this project. They're currently hiking the Appalachian Trail, but responsible for some of the insights that I'll be sharing today. So ethnobotany is a huge topic spanning every cultural relationship with plants, and so has disciplinary connections that extend beyond the sciences, although it looks particular ways when it's centered within the sciences. You have people engaged with ethnobotany at your institution. When I was preparing library instruction for a biology class visiting our special collections classroom last fall, I had a surprising amount of difficulty finding ethnobotany materials that I actually wanted to use. For some topics, I struggled to find any resources, and for others, it was too easy to find materials that centered colonialist perspectives or were problematic in other ways. I was also uncertain of my ability to evaluate the materials that I thought might be good choices. And if I'm having these problems as a librarian, then students are also having them. So I created this project to help me examine resources and come up with a plan. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 questions that our project examined. We wanted a deeper understanding of the needs for ethnobotany materials, the role that open access materials might play in the collection, and also the ways that librarians might support students in using ethnobotany resources and exploring topics. My examination has focused on ethnobotany materials oriented within the sciences, but I did hear about research in other disciplines that also connected with the topic. My funds vary each year, so having a sense of open access materials seemed appropriate for ensuring collection growth. I also had some anecdotal information about students struggling to find ethnobotany materials for specific assignments, and this was a great opportunity to find more ways to support them. Our project went through 5 phases. Isa and I were both interested in ethnobotany, but recognized that we had minimal knowledge of it as a distinct field of study. So our first phase was to develop and implement a plan to educate ourselves that took care to examine some of those issues I was sensing about representation of cultures in our materials. We then conducted an environmental scan through interviews with students, faculty, other researchers, asking them about things like learning goals, difficulties in finding information, and specific topics of interest. We took a deep look at our own collections using topics and strategies from those interviews, and we identified materials that we might want to acquire by looking at the collections of other libraries and offerings from publishers. Finally, we created a collection development plan and 2 library guides, one for a class that centers on their particular assignments and another more general ethnobotany subject guide. And this all looks pretty linear, and each phase was intended to inform future phases. But as we learned more, we sometimes needed to return to a previous phase. I'm still meeting people and learning about their needs, still tweaking those LibGuides, still learning about ethnobotany. Every phase remains active in some way right now, although I'm starting to have products to share. For our findings, first, we learned where our collections were stronger or weaker, and we also identified better ways to approach collection growth. I cannot stress enough that ethnobotanical works with a scientific focus show a range of ethical considerations, including none. And that has become the primary thing that I consider when adding to our collections. Second, we discovered lots of open access materials, but these also had substantial variation in quality, just as the purchased materials did. I'm happy to share my list of those materials, and I would welcome feedback. I hope it helps other librarians supplement their materials and develop a robust ethnobotany collection. Uh, Third, I have deep concern over scientific materials, journals, books, even assignments that disregard or obscure the cultural aspects of ethnobotanical knowledge. You'll see biopiracy companies talking about the ways that, they promote biodiversity and conservation while ignoring the impact that their work has on Indigenous communities. Students express their own awareness of this problem in the interviews. So those library guides that are intended for them, they highlight resources on ethical research and encourage students to evaluate ethnobotany resources based on those ethics and respect for Indigenous communities and their knowledge. Fourth, when cultural groups are marginalized, they're often excluded from forms of publication recognized by the dominant group. And this is especially evident in historical resources. And that knowledge ultimately might not be ours to collect in an academic library. However, the historical resources that we have are excellent ways to incorporate critical pedagogy if anyone likes Paulo Freire, and we're working on a special collections session that uses historical and contemporary works to trace the history of colonialism in ethnobotany and help students recognize how ethical methodologies appear in knowledge production. The QR code and bit.ly here link to a Google Doc with these slides, a list of open access journals and books that might add to materials in your collections, and also my notes on them, and my library guides and collection development policy. I also recognize that there could be librarians here from institutions where they are restricted from undertaking a project that requires the kind of DEI work that's inherent to developing an ethnobotany collection. If that applies to you, reach out to me anyway, and I am happy to help you think of ways to thoughtfully work with these materials. Thank you.
Abby, thank you so much. That was wonderful. All right, for our next presentation, we have April Colosimo with presenting support for evidence-based instructional practices and education research in science. April has been a science librarian at McGill University for 20 years. She is currently the liaison librarian for the departments of physics, chemistry, and mathematics and statistics, and for the McGill Community for Lifelong Learning. April, you're welcome to go ahead and begin.
Thank you so much. So my sabbatical research project is to investigate support for evidence-based instructional practices and education research in science. And the study population is teachers in the Faculty of Science at McGill, which is about 80% tenure track or tenured professors, and then non-tenured track positions. So for a total of 376 people. And I searched the education literature. So I looked for education-related papers from the study population, and then I also received ethics board approval from McGill to run a survey and follow-up interviews. So I had 41 respondents to the survey and 9 interviews. And I did a kind of a reflexive thematic analysis of the qualitative data, and I brought the themes back to the first interviewee and also to a librarian colleague as checks on how I might have got things wrong. So there's a lot of data, but I'm just going to focus on the results of the thematic analysis. And the themes and the sub-themes are divided into these 4 categories. So first, to what extent are they adopting evidence-based instructional practices at McGill in the Faculty of Science? And what do they think of as evidence? And then are they engaged with education research? So do they read the literature? Do they value the literature? And are they engaged in education research? So are they leading or participating in research projects? And then are they sharing their findings? And lastly, do they need or want help from the library? So here is the first theme. So I'm just going to move from left to right. So the first is that when it comes to their teaching practices, there is this everything is fine. You don't need to change anything messaging that is coming from their colleagues, and it's also coming from students. And so they're just continuing to do what works. They're learning through trial and error and also through internal evidence. So student evaluations and assessment data. But when it comes to AI, it's disrupting what works. And they're not really sure what to do about it, especially with their writing assignments. So teaching is not the main topic of conversation, but there are very teaching focused people in the departments. So there's this kind of gap in involvement. And then some of them wanted to talk about the positive drivers and the barriers to changing their teaching practices. So lack of incentives or rewards, or not enough graduate teaching assistants, or just the class sizes being too large, or just no time overall. But there were positive experiences, like co-teaching was an important driver, and also taking workshops where they had a chance to share with and learn from their colleagues. So then engagement with education research, most were just kind of unfamiliar with education literature, and unless they were one of those teaching focused folks, and if they are reading the literature, they're doing it sporadically. And since it's outside of their field, they find it hard to know if they can trust the results and conclusions, and they're kind of skeptical about qualitative research, and they're finding like lots of gaps and lags in the literature, and their searching is ad hoc, so they don't spend a lot of time searching, and they don't want to learn about alerts of any kind, at least this group. But there was agreement that it's important to take the time to share and kind of explain with students why you're doing your course differently, but they hadn't considered really sharing evidence from the literature with students, but they thought that maybe it's not that crazy of an idea. And they do want to offer learning resources to students. So less is known really in the literature about participation in education research in the sciences. And what they talked about is implementing changes, but not really checking to see if the outcome was a result of the change that they had made. So just not closing that loop. And that's because even though it's really interesting to them, it's just not a focus. So that education research side is not their focus. But they're doing really cool things that I got to hear about. Lots of outreach and citizen science projects. And they're supporting students, mostly grad students, and others doing education research. So that is where all of those education papers are coming from in the literature from this group. And they see not having qualitative research skills or experience writing education papers as a barrier. And also there's kind of an uncertainty for non-tenure track, those in non-tenure track positions around like doing research with their teaching. So not many survey respondents or interviewees really participated in any librarian consultations or activities offered through McGill libraries if they were related to their teaching. And the thematic analysis kind of helps explain why. First is that we have not made library help around teaching explicit. So they actually seemed surprised that that was an option. And one of the interviewees thought that it sounded like cheating to kind of ask a librarian for help with their teaching questions. And there was some enthusiasm around librarian help, but they weren't like really sure what it could mean. So hence the interrobang. So is there a role for librarians? Absolutely. What would that look like? I have no idea. But they did agree that most would benefit from workshops on getting started or staying up to date. And there's a kind of interest in finding usable instruments and measures. And lastly, they just thought that everyone would agree that it's a good idea to target grad students because they make important contributions to teaching and learning, and they're not getting enough training, or maybe what they're getting is not science focused enough, and that it bubbles up so they might learn from their grad students. So altogether kind of tells us a lot, I think, about how we can build a supporting program. And I put a Zotero library with lots of papers about evidence-based instructional practices for STEM teaching. Thank you.
Wonderful. April, thank you so much for that. We'll move now to our third lightning talk, and for this we have Non-English STEM, Supporting Multilingual Student Research by Kathy Lance. Kathy is a reference and instruction librarian at University of Illinois Chicago. As a liaison librarian, she works with the departments of Biological Sciences, Chemistry, and Earth and Environmental Sciences. Kathy, you're welcome to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Amy. And I have to comment that that was an excellent use of interrobang, April, in your presentation. I'm going to try and work that in my presentation, but I'm not sure if I'll make it. But the next one definitely will. Hi, everyone. Thank you to STS for having me here today to present the short talk on promoting multilingual STEM resources. Let me begin by telling you a bit about student diversity at UIC. This is a snapshot from the UIC data dashboard representing information on the 2024 undergraduate class. You can see that we are part of a federally designated minority-serving institution where 1 in 3 students speak at least one language in addition to English. Here's a section of the UIC Global Google map that shows where our students come from. You can see that there are red dots in countries all over the world, and our student populations represent native speakers of over 60 languages. In addition to the languages that students bring to UIC, 15 languages are also taught here in a range of majors, minors, and degrees. My goal with this project was to find a way to communicate to STEM students that the library had access to research in many languages, not just English. Because of ever-dwindling collection budgets, purchasing new databases or journal packages was not going to be an option. I decided to focus on the research content we already had. First, I looked further into my university's data dashboard to find the most commonly spoken languages. Then I played around with the filters in Web of Science, Scopus, and other commonly used STEM databases. I looked at what ebooks we had and talked with the interlibrary loan team about their experiences in requesting non-English materials. I decided to use a LibGuide to communicate these resources to students, as students already heavily rely on the biology, chemistry, and other LibGuides to find resources beyond Google Scholar. I looked at the science classes I taught in a normal semester and decided which ones would be the best fit for promotion of this new LibGuide. And here is the LibGuide, or I'll see if I can put it into chat. Oh, I stopped sharing. Hold on. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint again?
Yes, Kathy, we're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, great. So the LibGuide is not new. It's 3 years old at this point, and it has had over 750 views to date, which is not great, but here's how I've been using it in instruction and promoting it with students. As a liaison, I send welcome emails to new and returning faculty most semesters, sharing changes in collections, new workshops, etc. I've included a link and short descriptions of the non-English STEM resource guide in several of these emails. As I don't think it'll occur to most students to seek out science research in other languages, I've included cross-links. So if they find the biology research guide, then they'll also find the non-English STEM guide as well. Each fall, I meet with new graduate students and emphasize how this resource might be useful in their work or to the undergraduates that they work with. I also share this guide with classes I teach in the sciences. For example, BCQ is the Biology Colloquium. The Biology Colloquium at UIC is a student-run organization and class for individuals interested in biology or science-related fields. It provides students with an overview of diverse career opportunities available in biological sciences and provides information on field trips, research positions, study partners, and tutoring opportunities. 2 groups of BCQ students come to the library each semester. They spend 1 to 2 hours walking through the different floors of the library with their research teams. They have an itinerary that I provided, and they seek out different stations where they talk through citation managers, 3D printing options, what makes a good abstract, finding videos demonstrating lab techniques, etc. For the past 3 years, BCQ students have reviewed the non-English STEM research guide and provided feedback. After looking through the guide for a few minutes, students complete an online survey that I built using LibWizard. The first question I asked them is, what language or languages would it be useful for you to have research articles in? Almost half of the respondents chose English. Almost a quarter of the participants chose Spanish, and Arabic was the next highest language reported. A total of 25 different languages were mentioned by students, and 9% of participants mentioned that they could read or would read research articles in 2 or more languages in addition to English. The second question I asked in the survey is, would you use this guide? 32% said no, 25% said yes, and 41% said maybe. If you add the yeses to the maybes, that gets you to 66%, and I take that as an indication that this guide will be useful to students and that I should continue to develop it. I'm looking to highlight the guide upcoming at the international, or many different international student events next semester. I want to continue simplifying the verbiage on the guides in the vein of creating a plain language explanation of how to find research articles in other languages. I'm also working to apply for grants to pay for translators to have this guide translated into the top 2 or 3 languages spoken by UIC students. And I want to continue to identify science research and resources in other languages. I appreciate any feedback you have for me on the guide or resources you'd like to share. Here again is the guide, and you're welcome to email me with your comments or suggestions. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing the link to your guide in the chat. And so now to wrap up our forum today, we'll have Isabel Flindell and Ian Gordon presenting evidence synthesis in the biological and natural sciences, how STEM librarians can support these fledgling research communities. Isabel, they, them, is an MLIS student at Western University and collections librarian intern at Brock University. Ian Gordon is a recently retired Brock University Library STEM teaching and learning librarian with experiences as an evidence synthesis researcher and as part of an academic systematic reviews and evidence synthesis research team. You're welcome to go ahead and share your screen and begin.
Thanks for inviting us and to participate today. Thanks to Bill and Amy and Gwen. And there's the title of our presentation. And the context is that I'm part of an evidence synthesis team, and you would offer general evidence synthesis workshops through the school year in different formats. And you'd go around the room and you'd ask what disciplinary or departmental focus do you have? And you'd get medicine, applied health sciences, nursing, epidemiology. Every once in a while you get biology, ecology, conservation scientists. And you'd step back and ask yourself, now, how do I teach this to the whole class or the workshop? Or sometimes you get workshops for individual research teams in the biology and natural sciences. And you'd have to kind of figure out what works, what doesn't work, what is the evidence. The opportunities are involved in such that in our research that since 2000, year 2000, there's been a 47% increase in the number of biological and natural sciences, evidence synthesis, research publications. Whether they good, bad, or indifferent, it was our job to help support them with the new or experienced researchers to increase the validity, to increase the quality, and increase the impact of their particular studies as well. Resulted in a publication. Isabel is the lead author. Christian is another participant in this research. He's a graduate student in biology at Carleton University in Ottawa. So there's a copy that you can look for and a repository copy that you can check. We'll put this up at the very end and it'll be part of the slides as well. This particular publication helped answer these particular research questions. What distinctions or peculiarities do researchers in the natural and biological sciences encounter using evidence synthesis methodologies? How can academic librarians best support these researchers that utilize evidence synthesis research designs as well? I'm going to pass it over to Isabel, who's going to talk about our key findings.
Thanks, Ian. Do you want to click to the next slide, please? And so we found in our key findings a lack of formal training among researchers putting out these publications, a reliance on health science resources that are already existing, and a challenge to those health science resources by the heterogeneity of biological data. And we found that researchers have very high confidence levels conducting evidence synthesis work, but don't tend to make a ton of use of conducting and reporting standards. So to the lack of formal training, we asked survey participants to let us know how they learned to conduct evidence synthesis work, and got a lot of answers like the three we've highlighted here. So nothing really other than working with team members, reading scholarly articles that critique this methodology, no real training, work as a group of researchers that have this collective experience, no official training, use a variety of CEE resources, but mainly work as a team to ensure viability and best practices, borrowing strategies, frameworks from other successful studies. So there's a lot of ways that people are learning how to conduct this research informally, but there's perhaps a gap that libraries could fill when it comes to formal training opportunities. We also found a lot of mentions of using health science resources that already exist to conduct evidence syntheses in the biological and natural sciences, but researchers seem to perceive a need for discipline-specific tools that better accommodate non-health science research. As one participant said, there are no real official training materials or resources for conducting a valid biological study. We borrow from the health sciences, which is fair, but not appropriate when using an ecological lens and discerning data to find good answers to difficult research questions. And one of the reasons, perhaps one of these nuances to biological and natural science research that makes the health science tools not quite fit, is the heterogeneity of biological data. There's a variety of data types, sample sizes, and contexts in the biological and natural science research data that make synthesis challenging. As one researcher said, I think natural systems have a lot more variability between them, especially in environmental systems, where there's a lot less of an ability to control things in an experimental way. And finally, we found this very interesting. 42.1% of the articles that we sampled did not identify the use of any evidence synthesis conducting or reporting standards. Wow. Most of the researchers that we surveyed, on the other hand, and our survey research participants were drawn from the authorship of sample articles. So every researcher surveyed came from a sample article. Not every sample article author was surveyed. But most of the researchers that we surveyed were confident in their ability to conduct evidence syntheses. We asked them to rate on a scale from 1, not confident at all, to 5, extremely confident, their confidence in their ability to conduct evidence synthesis research, and had one person say 1, not confident at all, 7 said 2, 10 said 3, so very middle of the road. Our largest group, 30, said 4, and then 17 said 5 for extremely confident. So this disconnect between standards usage and researcher confidence was interesting to us and leads us to wonder, and perhaps this is something that someone can explore in the future, whether the standards that exist currently are not meeting the needs of biological and natural science researchers, or whether they're not sufficiently aware of the potential use of these standards. So we wanted to conclude with a few quick recommendations. First of all, as Ian mentioned, we do have a paper, so if you're interested in knowing more, there's a bit more detail there. And we'd urge everyone to support researchers' capacity to critically evaluate the quality of their work at every stage of the research process. And by getting involved, you may figure out, and we would love if you would share any disciplinary nuances that exist, because it's clear that they do impact evidence synthesis work. Thank you so much. If you have questions that we don't get to in the questions period, feel free to reach out via email.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Isabel and Ian. That concludes all of our presentations today. So we will now move once again into a Q&A period for our lightning talk presenters. Please feel free once again to put your questions in the chat or to raise your hand and then unmute and ask them.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get us started. It looks like we had one question in the chat. So April, in your interviews, did you find any science faculty that are engaged in scholarship of teaching and learning projects? And does your institution's library provide support for SOTL projects? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, I did. I do work with our Office of Science Education, so we do have an office that works with faculty and lecturers. And I was on the physics education research group, so we did some research around students' understanding of uncertainty. And I'm on the chemistry education research group, so we do have, like, I have had an opportunity just to get to know some folks. I also, on all of my, I'll just put chemistry in here, but on all of my subject guides, I usually include like information about SOTL or education research. So for chemistry, for math, for physics, and I try and make it specific to those. And those, I have had some comments from particular math that said, like, thanks for having these resources, and even suggested a couple of other things that might be useful. I haven't updated them since going on sabbatical in September, but I'll be back in a couple months. But yeah, I do know a lot of folks working on SOTL. I think the biggest issue for them is writing. So they always tell me, "Oh yeah, I have this I've had this data for 2 years sitting on my laptop. Oh yeah, I did questions about student anxiety and all sorts of really, really interesting projects, but they haven't written them up." So that's like the kind of closing of the loop of the SOTL as well, as like you have to also share it. It's not enough just to ask those questions. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Thank you. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute.
Bill, feel free to unmute.
Here I am. Hello. I've got a question for Abby about assessing the quality of ethnobotanical resources. Here at San Francisco State, we have folks studying ethnobotany from a variety of different angles, and they're looking for different sorts of things in their resources. Some folks are looking for chemical detail breakdowns. Some are looking for anthropological reports. Some are looking for personal, subjective reports. With all these different standards, how do you go about figuring out what's right for whom with all these different audiences?
That's a great question. One of the first things that I did when it comes to like academic journals, I actually looked at the author guidelines. What are they saying that they want authors to do to talk about within these articles? And you'll see things like indicate compliance with the Nagoya Protocol, or even just to talk about other ethical standards like the Society for Ethnobiology. They have a code of ethics that winds up being something that a lot of journals ask people to follow, but even just acknowledging the ways that they worked with Indigenous communities, like as a basic standard. A lot of journals don't require that, but some do. And there's a lot of variation in there, especially within different disciplines like ethnopharmacology. There are different standards out there, but just kind of saying, hey, do something. Another way that I went about looking at things that's like a totally different angle, you'll see some of these journals appearing in journal citation reports for various categories. So that kind of speaks a little more to the science that's involved, rather than the ways that they might respect intellectual property or working with communities. But there are a few good angles to go down. I have yet to find that resource that uses all of them, but
Thank you very much.
thanks.
I have a question for Kathy. Have you had faculty pushback against students using non-English language resources in their research? And if so, how have you responded to that?
Thank you. I had one faculty member who I was collaborating with on a newsletter piece, looking specifically at one of our Chinese language databases, which is CNKI, which has specific agricultural information as well as chemistry. And the faculty member in charge of the newsletter questioned why I would promote it, why I thought the need to call attention to it. And I gave the statistics about how many students at UIC speak Chinese and how many students, international students, we actually have on campus in a range of different programs, and how many students graduate level collaborate with writers in China. And so there are multiple levels of why somebody would want that research. We also talked about translation tools and how they've improved in the past 10 years considerably. And so that I didn't think it would be quite the same burden if a student is using research in another language. When I talk about it in class, I always explain to students that the onus is on them to quote the segments and perhaps even provide an abstract in English if they are going to turn it in for an assignment or share it with a group of students who don't share their language abilities. And the faculty member had nothing to say to that. So I assume that was enough of a conversation about why that was viable. And no one else has brought it to my attention.
That's a great response to that pushback. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We still have a couple minutes if there are any final questions. All right, I'm not seeing anything. Gwen, you're not seeing anything in the chat either, it looks like. Okay. So as we end today, I just want to extend my thanks once again to all of our presenters. We really greatly appreciate your presentations and the thoughtful answers that you provided for us today. I also want to thank the STS Research Committee members for planning this event and for all of you for taking time out of your day to attend our annual forum. So thank you so much and have a really wonderful rest of your day.